Today's case takes us to California, where a man known as the Doodler is suspected of killing 16 men. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. San Francisco is the 4th most populous in California and 17th most populous in the US. It is the 2nd most densely populated large US city after New York City. As we know, California has had some of the most notorious serial killers to date. Those include the Golden State Killer, the Night Stalker, the Hillside Strangler, and of course, the Zodiac. But today we will be examining a serial killer that many people don't know of, and that's because nobody knows who this man is. During the 1970s in San Francisco, the Doodler, as he became known, would frequent gay bars and restaurants to find his victims. The Doodler did receive his name from how he managed to lure his victims to their death. Investigators believe that the serial killer would sit at the table or at a bar, and he'd begin to sketch his victims from a distance. Once he had a sketch, he would walk up to the victim, show him the doodle that he made of them, and say, "Do you like my doodle?" This unidentified serial killer was believed to be responsible for up to 16 murders and 3 assaults of men in San Francisco, California, between January of 1974 and September of 1975. And of course, the Doodler received his nickname based on the fact that he would sketch his victim before murdering them. And it seemed like he did the same thing every time. He would go to a gay bar or restaurant, he'd sit down, look for a victim, he would sketch them, and then approach them with it. After a sexual encounter, he would then murder them. Gerald Earl Cavanagh was a Canadian-American immigrant, and he's believed to be the Doodler's first victim. At the time of the murder, he was 49 years old, and he had been stabbed to death. On January 24th, 1974, his fully clothed body was located, lying face up on Ocean Beach in San Francisco, and his body was found in the early hours of the morning. But it does appear that he died hours before. An autopsy would determine that he had been conscious at the time he was killed, and because there was defensive wounds, they know that he attempted to resist the killer. At first, Gerald was listed as John Doe number 7 because nobody could identify him. Eventually, they would find out who he was, and all I really know about him is that he was a single man, and really that's it. There's not too many details about his life. On June 25th, 1974, Joseph J. Stevens, who went by his nickname Jay, was discovered by a woman who was walking along a lake in San Francisco. Joseph J. Stevens was 27 at the time that he was murdered, and it appears that he died shortly before his body was found. As investigators were looking into his murder, they realized that he had been at a club the previous day. He was employed as a, quote, female impersonator and comedian. Investigators do believe that Joseph J. Stevens was alive at that lake, and he probably transported himself to the area with the killer. On July 7th, 1974, Klaus Christmann, who was a German-American immigrant, was discovered by a woman who was also walking her dog. And he was found, just like Gerald, at Ocean Beach in San Francisco. Investigators did note that his death seemed more violent than the others. He did have considerably more stab wounds, and it seems that his throat had been slashed several times. But his body was fully clothed. The thing is, unlike previous victims, Klaus was married and had children. Police would say that because Klaus had a makeup tube on his person when he died, that perhaps he was a closeted gay man. Of course, we know that's not necessarily true. He could have just been at the wrong place at the wrong time. We don't know. 32-year-old Frederick Elmer Kappen was discovered on May 12, 1975 in San Francisco. He had been stabbed like the other victims, and it seemed that he died because of the strikes to his aorta. Investigators believe his body had been moved about 20 feet as there was disturbances in the sand nearby. Frederick would be identified by his fingerprints, not because he was a criminal, but because he was a nurse. He had also served in the U.S. Navy, where he was awarded medals for his service. Harold Goldberg was a 66-year-old man and a Swedish-American immigrant, and he was discovered on June 4th, 1975. and by then, it seems that he had been decomposing for about 2 weeks. He was found in Lincoln Park. The thing is, his remains were slightly inconsistent with the other homicides. First, because he was far older than the other men, his underwear had been taken, and his pants were unzipped. Harold had been believed to be the final victim of the Doodler until January of 2022. In January of 2022, police were able to identify a 6th victim of the Doodler. Warren Andrews was a lawyer for the U.S. Postal Service, and he was murdered in Land's End in April 1975 at the age of 52 years old. As I mentioned, the suspect has never been caught, but police do feel that they're moving closer every day to catching him. So this was happening in 1970, and of course, we have to remember that during the 1970s, police departments weren't always friendly towards the LGBTQ plus community. And of course, that meant that these communities certainly wouldn't trust the police. Obviously, a serial killer was running rampant, killing gay men, and the police weren't doing anything about it. But police did have some leads at the time. At 1:30 a.m. on a January morning, an anonymous caller would call the police. The caller would say, "I believe there might be a dead person on the beach. I thought I saw somebody lying there, but I didn't want to get too close to him because you never know what could happen." The operator would ask the man if he wanted to give his name, and he said, "No, I don't think that's necessary. I just wanted to let somebody know, maybe he needs help or something, but I felt it was my duty to report it." Although police didn't know who this anonymous caller was at the time, they're now asking him to come forward because he might have seen or heard something that they could possibly use to solve the case. Interestingly enough, police think that the Doodler was seeing a psychiatrist with the last name Priest. Apparently, this psychiatrist was practicing in the East Bay, and police are still searching for them. But investigators never released why or how they obtained this information. It turns out that police did have a suspect in this case. The thing is, they couldn't proceed with criminal charges because 3 victims had been assaulted and survived the attack. But these 3 victims didn't want to out themselves by going to court. Again, I want to note that it's the 1970s. Times were incredibly different than they are now. Among the stabbing victims that survived was a well-known entertainer and a diplomat. At the time, the suspect had cooperated with police during his interview, but he never admitted guilt for the murders and attacks. Officers did say that they strongly believe this man in question was responsible for the crimes, including the murders, but he was never tried or convicted because of the survivors' refusals to appear in court. To date, the suspect has not been named publicly, and of course he hasn't been arrested, and very little information is available to the public about the crimes. Even if these 3 surviving victims didn't want to come forward, it appears that the police didn't have enough evidence in general. I mean, if their only evidence is going to be the testimony of 3 victims, then I'm not sure they should be trying the case. And I'm not saying that to be harsh or anything, but that's the type of case where you can certainly present reasonable doubt. My first question would be, did they, get a search warrant? Did they check out this suspect's home? Did they look for evidence? Did they have anything else other than perhaps the victims could identify this perpetrator? Obviously, you don't want to try a case unless you can bring it home and the person is actually guilty. Because if you try this person for murder and they get off, that's double jeopardy. So theoretically, you could be letting a serial killer walk out the door. In 1975, police were able to come up with a sketch of the Doodler based on the surviving victims. Police would say the Doodler at the time was between 19 and 25 years old. He was black, lanky, and around 6 feet tall. They also released a new sketch, which is an age progression based on the 1975 drawing. So going back to that suspect that has never been charged, but police do believe was responsible for the crimes, that person is still alive and, of course, a person of interest. The detective working the case wouldn't say if the suspect matches the drawings, if that description matched him to a T, or if it was similar, if it was not. But what I find even more interesting is the fact that they have DNA evidence. So I'm assuming because they have DNA evidence and they have a person of interest, they're going to do their best to see if they can either clear him or, of course, if he's the killer, arrest him. Investigators did submit the DNA and are waiting for further results. Hopefully they will get some later this year. They also plan on using forensic genealogy, which is what led to the capture of the Golden State Killer. Police have doubled their offer for any information leading to the arrest of this serial killer. They once had a $100,000 reward, and that is now at $200,000. I'm very hopeful that because police have DNA, that they might be able to track down a suspect and bring justice to the men who were murdered and even the men that were assaulted. I can't imagine being one of these 3 men who were assaulted and had to live the rest of their lives in fear. I mean, I don't think that's something you can get over, knowing your attacker is still out there. I can imagine it's incredibly hard to deal with. Police do believe that the Doodler is responsible for at least 16 murders. Hopefully, with this DNA evidence, they will be able to close this case and, of course, bring justice to any other victims out there. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.